This is the first in a series of lessons on muscles. In this lesson we're going to be focusing on the growth structure of muscles and the different types of muscle tissue. These are the learning objectives for this lesson. Hopefully a lot of this stuff will seem quite familiar to you because we have already covered the different types of muscle tissue when we looked at cells in the first couple of booklets, and hopefully you may recognize some of these muscle names from general knowledge. These are the key words associated with this lesson, and it is important that you are able to use them appropriately when writing test answers. Alright, so first thing we're going to be looking at is the function of muscles. So muscles allow us to move. They generate body heat through friction between muscle cells, and they actually help to stabilize our bodies in position. So it's really important functions. Now, the control of muscles, specifically skeletal muscles, is voluntary. And that means that we are consciously aware of what we're doing, and we use our brains, the conscious part of our brain, to think about how we're going to get our bodies to move in space. The other type of muscle control is involuntary, and again, this means that we are not using our conscious brain to make decisions about what we're doing. It's all happening without us thinking about it. Now, when we look at the characteristics of muscles, we need to know the four basic types. So muscles have contractibility, so they can generate force by shortening. They have extensibility, which means they can be stretched without breaking. They are elastic, so they can return to their original shape after that extensibility. And they will respond to chemicals by neurons, neurotransmitters, which means they are excitable. Okay, so just a recap here of the different types of muscle tissue. If we look over here on the left, we have got cardiac muscle, and we can see that it's cardiac muscle because of these branching points, and the cardiac muscle tissue has these little intercalated discs, not visible on this cartoon, but it's a definite giveaway structure that you'd only see in cardiac muscle. With skeletal muscle, it's arranged in these long stripy tubes. And smooth muscle, which is found in the gut, is quite uniform, and it doesn't really have a distinctive appearance when you look at it under a microscope. So out of the three types of muscle, only skeletal muscle is voluntary. Now here, if we look at the different types of muscle under a microscope, we can see, again, we'll start with cardiac muscle. It's striated, which means it's got the stripy appearance, and you can see that there. You can see these little intercalated discs I was talking about, those darker vertical regions between the individual cells. This tissue we know is under involuntary control, so we don't have to think about pumping blood around our bodies. If we look at the skeletal muscle in this diagram here, you can see that it's actually really true to the cartoon picture. We can see that each muscle cell has got many nuclei associated, so we call that multinucleated. It's a voluntary tissue, and it has this tubular appearance. And finally, smooth muscle over here, again, looks very much like the cartoon. You can see these long cells with these tapered ends. They are single nucleated rod-shaped cells, and they're typically found within the walls of internal organs. And again, this type of movement is involuntary. So if we look at skeletal muscles, just to summarize what we've talked about, skeletal muscle is attached to bones, which allows us to move, and it gives our body shape. It's under conscious control, and we would describe these cells as being striated, cylindrical tubes, and they are multinucleated. If we look at cardiac muscle tissue, we know that it's the muscle found in the heart. It's involuntary. Again, it's also striated, however, it's branching, and each cell has a single nucleus. finally, the smooth muscle, which we know is also involuntary. It is found in the walls of some organs and structures such as the arteries and arterioles. It's an involuntary type of muscle that allows for slow and sustained contraction. It's not striated, it's made up of tapered rods, and it also has a single nucleus per cell. So in this lesson, we're going to be focusing on skeletal muscles and how they attach muscle to bone and allow us to move. So before we move on, please make sure that you complete pages 16 and 17 of your booklet and also complete review questions 8.1 on page 195 of your textbook. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you have completed all that work. We're going to jump ahead to page 23 of your booklet, and we are going to be looking at the overall growth structure of the muscular anatomy, just at a really basic level. So the first thing we want to know is how muscles attach to the skeleton. And they do that through the connective tissue called tendons. Alright, so we need to understand that tendons will attach muscle to bone, and we should already know that ligaments attach bone to bone. Now, when muscles attach to bones, they form a bridge, so it's between two different bones. So you have the origin where that muscle is fixed on one bone, and then you have the muscle itself and the insertion point where you have that anchoring tendon goes onto a different bone. Okay, now the reason why you need the tendons on the origin and the insertion going on different bones is because this is how we achieve movement through this pulley system. And this large fleshy part of our muscle is called the belly of the muscle. So that's new words that we have looked at in this slide. So the origin tendon is where you have the muscle fixed to a stationary bone, and the insertion part of that tendon at the other end is where you have it a tendon fixed to a moving bone. So some key information that we need to know about skeletal muscles is that they are voluntary, so we have to think to get them to move. And muscles can only contract, which means that they can only get shorter. They can relax and then go back to their original shape, but their actual movement is only contraction. Muscles can only move one way, therefore, which means they can only pull. And muscles work in pairs that do opposite actions, which means they are antagonists. So if someone's antagonistic, then they're saying the opposite of what you want to say. You must have heard that phrase before. So in this case, muscles that work in pairs are always antagonistic to each other. That is to say, when one muscle contracts, the other muscle must relax. An example of that here is in the upper arm. We have got the biceps muscles on the front, so it's attached to the scapula, so that's the origin tendons, and the insertion is on the radius at this point here. So you can see that it's bridging across this joint, and we have the belly of the muscle here. So when that biceps is contracted, you can see that on the other side, the antagonistic muscle, the triceps muscles, are relaxed. And then again, you can see the origin on the scapula, and you can see the insertion on the ulnus, which is underneath the radius. So the ulnar here and the radius. If we look at the opposite position here, when the arm is extended, we can see that the triceps muscle is contracting and the biceps muscle is relaxing. So when you are asked to describe movement at a joint, please make sure that you talk about antagonistic pairs of muscles and you name those muscles. So again, just to reinforce those points, the agonist in an antagonistic pair is the muscle that produces the movement. So if you are decreasing the angle at joint, which is flexion. The agonist is the one that is causing that movement. So because we're decreasing the angle in the arm, it's the biceps muscle that's doing that. The antagonist will yield to the action of the agonist. So the antagonist will just go with it, if you like. It will just do the opposite, and it just allows for this movement to happen. Okay, so what I would like you to do for task 2 is to actually observe what happens to different muscle groups when you carry out the following tasks. So put a pen in your hand and bend your arm at the elbow. And I want you to be thinking about what muscle is causing that action, which is the agonist and which is the antagonist. Where would you find the origin and the insertion point for these muscles? And think about that for also when you straighten your arm, bend your leg and straighten your leg. Now I would like you to watch the video on the next slide once you've done that. That's this video here, and see if that has helped you to understand the different types of movement. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at page 25 in your booklet of notes, and we're going to be looking at how movement is smooth in the human body. Now, it doesn't just rely on agonists and antagonists. We also have groups of muscles called synergists and fixators. Synergist muscles are muscles that help the agonist, that's the one causing the movement, to do its job by steadying the joint. So this allows for the smooth, precise movement at a particular body part. Okay. Now the other type of helping muscle is the fixator. So the fixator is a synergist that works to immobilize a joint. So if you want to hold your arm out straight, then you would be allowing your arm to be into a raised position by the deltoid muscles on your shoulder, and you would recruit the synergist and fixator muscles of the pectoralis major and minor to hold your arm in that position. So here again is a nice description of a synergist and a fixator. I'd encourage you just to stop the video here and read this information and even see how it feels in your own body. Can you feel those movement of those muscles? Alright, so now we are just going to summarize all those words that we've talked about. We've got the origin of the biceps, which is attached to the scapula, so that's like the shoulder blade. The origin, remember, is the tendon, so tendons attach muscle to bone. The other end, we've got the insertion tendon, and this attaches onto the forearm. We have the biceps muscle here at the front, which is a flexor muscle. When it contracts, it decreases the joint, the angle of the joint here, so that allows for the movement of flexion. The triceps muscle is an extensor muscle. So what this actually does when we contract the triceps muscle, it increases the angle and allows for us to straighten our arms. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at muscle tone and what this means. Now, muscle tone is about maintaining partial contraction of the skeleton at any given time. So what this means is that some muscle fibers within the muscle itself will be relaxing and others will be contracting. The reason why you want this is because you don't want everything contracting and relaxing at the same time, and you want to give some of those muscle fibers a rest so you can maintain this for a long period of time. And that's the basis of posture, and it helps us to sit, stand in a certain way based on muscle tone. Now that we've covered some of that learning of these different key words, an example of a question that you might get would be, explain using an example such as muscles in the arm, how skeletal muscles work in antagonistic pairs to produce movement. and you will have to include the terms origin, insertion, agonist, belly, extensor, flexor and fixator. So understanding what those words are and using the correct terminology in the correct way will attract lots of marks. Another question that you might get could be, give the role of synergistic muscles. So that's stabilizer muscles. Again, within this answer, you would incorporate these keywords. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at other muscles within the human body. So we're going to be focusing on the upper arm, seeing as that's what we've been talking about. Now, when we look at the biceps muscle, it's not just one muscle. We actually have a few in here. So we've got the biceps brachii, and then underneath that you can see a little bit of peeking out here. This is the brachialis, and then in the forearm we have the brachioradialis. Now, I'm not expecting you to commit all of these words to memory, but it's just to illustrate that the human anatomy is much more complicated than what we've been led to believe. So let's look at the biceps brachii. So this is these two muscle pairs here. We've got the long head one and the short head one. Now, the biceps brachii muscles are large fleshy muscles at the front of the arm, also known as the anterior of the arm. So they sit on front of the humerus. It has two origins that attach onto the shoulder blade of the scapula. So you can see one origin there and the other one over here. And this is an agonist in flexion. So it allows flexion or the narrowing of that angle to be achieved. The antagonist is at the triceps on the back of the arm, and you can see how that movement occurs here in this diagram. Okay, so let's look at brachialis. So this is the smaller muscle that lies underneath the biceps muscle. So these are the two biceps muscles that we looked at before. We've taken them away and we're looking just at brachialis. Now, the reason why we're talking about this muscle group underneath the biceps is because brachialis is a synergist. And this allows for smooth flexion at the elbow. That is, remember, decreasing that joint between, or the angle of the joint between the forearm and the humerus. Now, on the back of the arm, we have the triceps brachii. And this is a much flatter muscle, and it helps with extension of the arm. And again, it has more than one origin which attaches onto the scapula. That's our fixed point. And it is an agonist for extension, and it's an antagonist to the biceps muscles. So it does the opposite. Now, there's quite a large muscle group found in men and women, but men tend to train it more, so it tends to be more prominent there. These are the pectoralis muscles. So what we normally refer to as the pecs is pectoralis major. That's this really large muscle group. Underneath that, we do have pectoralis minor as well, which is a smaller muscle group on the chest. Now, the reason why we're talking about the pectoralis muscles is because they are fixator muscles. These will stabilize the shoulder joint and the arm, and they keep it the arm fixed in position while we have the extension and flexion brought about by the biceps and the triceps. Okay, now we're going to be looking at the lower limbs. And first group of muscles that we're going to be looking at on the lower limbs are the hamstrings. Now, these are located on the posterior or the back of the leg, and we can see them highlighted in red here. Now, the hamstrings are a group of muscles located, as I said, on the back of the thigh, attached to the back of the femur bone, and they are antagonistic to the muscles found on the front of the thigh, the quadriceps. The action of the hamstrings are to extend the upper leg at the hip. So imagine you were doing like a donkey kick, or extends the leg backwards. And it also flexes the lower leg at the knee. So imagine you were like kicking up towards your backside. So this is a sort of pulling action that raises the lower limbs to the buttocks. The quadriceps found on the front of the legs. This is a group of muscles that are found on the front of that femur, and they are antagonistic to the hamstrings. Now, the quadriceps on the front of the leg, they will flex the knee up towards the hip, so this will allow you to get that knee to chest action. And it also extends the lower leg. So if you straighten your leg out, you will feel your quadriceps muscles engaging, and this allows you to do actions like kick a ball. Now, finally, the really big group of muscles that you have in the lower body are the gluteus maximus muscles. So these are really large muscles that power a lot of your movement and keep your back in position. So it's the largest of all the gluteal muscles, the gluteus maximus. It gives shape to the buttocks, and it also extends from the pelvis, as you can see, and attaches onto the femur. It is a really important fixator muscle, and it helps to stabilize your hips and your legs, and it allows your quadriceps and your hamstrings to work smoothly. Last of the lower limb muscles we're going to be looking at are the ones found on the shins. So you've got tibialis anterior. So if you feel on the outside of either leg and you flex your toes up towards your shin, you'll feel that muscle engaging. This is the tibialis anterior, and what it does is it allows for dorsiflexion. So it allows you to point your toes up towards your shin. On the back of that, those two bones, you have got the gastrocnemius muscles, and those are your calf muscles. And these gastrocnemius muscles will eventually attach onto the heel bone through the Achilles tendons. You know, this big thick tendon that runs down the back of your ankle. This is a really important muscle group and tendons, and it allows for antagonistic movement to the tibialis anterior. So this allows for plantar flexion. So it allows you to point your toes. So imagine when these calf muscles contract, it pulls that tendon and allows you to point your toes upwards, or downwards, I should say. Okay, last muscle we're going to be looking at is the synergist here, which is the tibialis posterior. So posterior, remember, means at the back. So this is a synergist to the gastrocnemius or calf muscles, and it assists you in pointing your toes. So if you're a ballet dancer, it would assist you in a really elegant way to point your toes, and it is found in between those two lower limb bones. That's the tibia and fibula. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson. What I'd like you to do is to complete pages 23 to 25 of your class notes, and please complete questions 8.3 of the textbook found on page 202. I would also like you to reread the pages 200 to 202 so that you get a really good understanding of what we've talked about, and you can visualize each of these muscles and how they move.